This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, a quick update from the markets. So according to Bloomberg data, the JSE Top 40 is essentially on course for its best year since 2017. In fact, so far this year, it's up around 18%. Some pretty solid numbers there. Shares of the food and liquor retailer Spar fell by over 7% today, however, back to levels that we saw last in August. The firm has cancelled contracts it described as onerous with retailers in Poland. In East Africa, since its September peak of around 2,066 points, Kenya's NSE 20 has had a one-way journey south since then. It's down 8% since then to today's level. If that trend continues, the year's low of 1,838 points could be back in sight before the middle of December. In fact, for the first time since May, Safaricom is now back under 40 Kenyan shillings per share. Here's what's coming up tonight. Ghana's finance minister is tabling an ambitious plan to cut the fiscal deficit down to around 4%. The COVID-19 pandemic has pushed over 13 million Africans into extreme poverty. How do we deal with that problem? And the WTO is pushing for multilateral trade deals to boost global economic resilience in the wake of some pretty unexpected shocks. Our starting point tonight is in West Africa. Ghana's finance minister, Ken Ofori-Atta, has announced plans to cut the fiscal deficit in order to boost economic growth and increase financial sustainability in order to retain investor confidence. Now, the government has also announced plans to implement measures aimed at boosting revenue to reduce the fiscal shortfall to around 7.4% of GDP next year from a revised figure of 12.1% this year. Total revenue and grants are forecast to rise 43% next year to around $16.4 billion. Expenditure, however, is estimated at $22.4 billion, an increase of 23% year on year. Growth in 2022 is forecast at just under 6%. All right, then, so those are some of the highlights of the 2022 budget. But what do markets at home and abroad make of it? Let's explore some of the implications with Mark Boland, who's a senior credit research analyst at Red Intelligence. Mark, good to have you on the program. So Ghana spent big in 2020. Its fiscal deficit, including energy, financial costs, went over 15% of GDP. But based on what you've seen so far today, is this a credible plan to lower Ghana's debt burden? Mark, if you can hear me, based on what you've heard today, is this budget a credible plan to lower Ghana's debt burden? All right, we'll move on and try and clean up the sound on that particular link a little later in the hour. Now, the International Monetary Fund has ruled out releasing more funding to the government in Zimbabwe, citing its unsustainable debt loads and external debt arrears. The IMF team has concluded its virtual meetings with the authorities in Zimbabwe, and it wants the government to restructure its debt and seek assurances from its creditors on future financing. The mission chief for Zimbabwe, Daneshwar Gura, also called on Zimbabwe to allow much greater official exchange rate flexibility and to tackle forex market distortions as a matter of priority. Now, the reforms, according to the fund, are paramount to improving the business climate and reducing government vulnerabilities. The IMF has, however, commended the government's swift response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which has aided in mitigating its adverse impact on the economy. All right, then let's get back to our lead story. Ghana, of course, announcing its budget for 2022. It's a fairly ambitious one, with the finance minister aiming to essentially drastically reduce the fiscal budget in the country. Mark Boland joins us once again on the program as a senior credit research analyst at Red Intelligence. Mark, based on what you've seen and heard today, is this a credible plan to bring Ghana's debt problem under control? All right, unfortunately, we're having a few technical gremlins to deal with tonight. Now, on to Kenya. It's set to take up a fifth sovereign bond, targeting close to $1 billion in the next fiscal year. with the Finance Ministry also leaning towards issuing its first green bond. Now, the government has in the last 7 years issued at least 4 different Eurobonds, netting a total of $7.8 billion. The Finance Ministry confirmed in its draft 2022 budget policy statement that it intends to tap into green financing in the upcoming fiscal year. It adds that it's targeting funds as part of the net external budget deficit financing amounting to about $3.2 or so billion in the 2022-2023 fiscal year. All right, then let's run through some company headlines. Let's start with MTN South Africa. It's reached an agreement to sell its cell phone towers to IHS Towers for about $413 million. The move aims to bolster the company's assets for the anticipated auction of the spectrum. MTN will sell and then lease back more than 5,700 of its towers in South Africa, including some 4,000 greenfield and 1,700 rooftop sites. It will also be outsourcing power and related services. The deal is expected to be finalized in the first quarter of 2022, subject to regulatory approvals. South Africa's Tiger Brands has become the latest major firm to be subjected to a damaging strike. This comes after the company suffered losses of more than $9.6 million due to the unrest in July. Members of the African Meat Industry and Allied Trade Union embarked on an indefinite wage strike last Wednesday after the union received a certificate on non-resolution from the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration. The union is demanding a 7% wage hike, well above inflation. Management, however, has only offered 3%. In East Africa, the standard gauge railway line that runs from Nairobi to Mombasa is fully booked ahead of Christmas. The move is set to boost bus companies and airlines as families look to enjoy holidays along Kenya's coastline. Airlines have also increased fares from Nairobi to the port city of Mombasa ahead of Christmas on early bookings, and the ticket prices are expected to rise even further in the days to come. And Amazon is set to cease accepting Visa credit cards issued in the UK from January 19th, owing to high credit card transaction fees. But Visa debit cards will still be accepted by the e-commerce firm. Now, the company adds that costs should be going down over time due to advances in tech, but instead it says they just keep rising. That's a run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. The COVID-19 pandemic has pushed over 30 million Africans into extreme poverty. And China's direct investment in Africa tops over $43 billion. The numbers coming up next.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back to the program. You're watching Global Business Africa. Now let's head over to Sudan. Thousands of people over there have taken part in protests against last month's coup in Sudan. Security forces shooting dead at least 10 people and wounding dozens of others. Now, the Central Committee of Sudanese Doctors, it's a group of medics aligned with the protest movement. They say that security forces fired live bullets and tear gas after mobile phone communications were cut earlier in the day. Ahead of the demonstrations, authorities closed 4 out of the 10 bridges linking Khartoum with the cities of Bari and Omdurman. The army chief, Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, was sworn in last week as the head of a new transitional council. He appointed himself to lead the country. Pro-democracy groups have promised to continue protesting until the return of civilian rule. All right, then let's revisit our top story. Ghana presenting its budget for 2022. Fairly ambitious in regard to trying to essentially reduce the fiscal deficit that the country is running. But what does the market actually make of the spending plan that was presented today? Let's explore that with Mark Boland, who's a senior credit research analyst at Red Intelligence, and he joins us now live on the program. So, Mark, Ghana, of course, spending really big in 2020. Its fiscal deficit went over 15% of GDP. Based on what you heard today, do we have a credible plan to bring the fiscal deficit down?
Well, I mean, Ghana has been spending very big for several years, I mean, for close to a decade, but as pretty much all countries, they had a blowout in 2020 because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the deficit has come back a little bit since, but it's now becoming more of a concern for an investor. So the Eurobonds have tanked following the announcement of the budget. It's hard to say exactly what the Eurobond investors were expecting. I mean, it's been clear for a while that Ghana is very constrained with how much they can actually reduce the deficit, because both the interest costs and the public sector wage bill essentially are, about 50% of government revenue already. So, I mean, that's two big areas where it's very difficult to actually make any cuts, but yeah, I think it's clear in the past month or so that where Ghana has previously benefited from the doubt among a lot of international investors, which have kept on buying Ghana's Eurobonds and also invested in the domestic debt, even though the fiscal metrics have been very challenging. But this has changed over the past month and a half and so, and the 2022 budget has definitely not improved the sentiment among investors.
And speaking of debt, though, because we're talking about inflation no longer being a transitory issue in most of the most of the developing markets, developed markets, the United States, the UK, Europe, and so on and so forth. So essentially, that window for Ghana being able to get back into the markets and borrow some more money to refinance, that's basically closed now, isn't it?
Well, I think it's less to do with actually inflation in developed markets than to do with Ghana's fiscal metrics. I mean, I've been looking at Ghana, for several years now, but I did take a look at the end of last year when Cote d'Ivoire, other countries that started to come back to marketing, to the Eurobond market in Ghana, made this, or the finance minister made this big announcement. They were going to issue 5 billion in Eurobonds. And initially, I was just very skeptical that they would be able to sell any Eurobonds at all, considering the state of the public finances. But talking to Eurobond investors and other potential investors, just still had this kind of very optimistic view. So I did actually change that view in the end and said they would issue somewhere close, would be able to issue about 2 to 3 billion, which is what they did in March. But now I think the sentiment has changed, and even though there's not very much Eurobond issuance in the 2022 budget, I think if Ghana remains locked out of the Eurobond market, I think the prospect of Ghana applying for external debt restructuring is drawing closer.
Okay, so roughly a third of Ghana's expenditure is just going into debt service. If you throw in public wages as well, that essentially goes all the way to 50%, give or take. But assuming vaccination rates and GDP growth rates remain basically where they are at the moment, what can Ghana do within its limited resource envelope to essentially keep debt service costs where they are or even lower them over the medium term?
Yes, I mean, all countries or governments try to claim they're going to grow out of debt, but that very rarely happens. I mean, what Ghana has been doing, authorities have been doing last year, was that the Bank of Ghana came in and bought large amounts of the debt. And this is in a way kind of a transfer from one part of the government, the finance ministry, to the other part. Well, of the Bank of Ghana is not part of the government, but it's part of the Ghanaian state. And Eurobond investors were not particularly concerned about this last year. I mean, this is normally something that makes them head for the exit. So of course you could have the Bank of Ghana continuing to buy government bonds and remit the yields on that back to the government in kind of a circle way. But are you seeing now that the foreign investors primarily are becoming increasingly concerned about this? So it's a question for how long they can do that. And even though Ghana's not planning to issue Eurobonds next year, if this concern spreads to the domestic market and people start shifting from the cedi into US dollar assets, I think you're going to see a more pressure on the cedi and actually a faster drain of Ghana's FX reserves than we're actually seeing at the moment.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. Mark Boland from Red Intelligence. Always good having you on the program. Thank you. Now then, back to East Africa. The hotel industry in Kenya is slowly getting its groove back as most of the staff that were laid off at the start of the pandemic are now coming back to work. As CGTN's Nick Mudimba now reports, the relaxing of pandemic restrictions is gradually helping many in the hospitality business to get a lot of their old clients back.
The COVID-19 pandemic hit the world, and one of the most affected industries was the hospitality industry. In Kenya, many workers had to go on unpaid leave while some were fired. WILFRED, SAVAI, a member of the staff at James Suites Hotel in Kenya's capital, Nairobi, is among the many in the industry who are away from work on unpaid leave for close to 5 months. He's now back at work and thankful for the opportunity.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, we really struggled. I went home for 3 months unpaid, but our management really tried to give us shifts. I thank God because right now I'm fully back to work and now I can survive and feed my family. They are very happy now that I'm back to work.
The once vibrant industry is slowly getting back on its feet.
Hotel industry is run by people. Hotel industry is run by the clientele. So the best fast track to this is when everything opened up, everybody went out again to the restaurants, to the hotels. And this was easy for us to bring back our staff.
According to the World Bank, Kenya's GDP is projected to grow by 4.5% in 2021, signaling a partial recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Economic activity is estimated to accelerate to above 5% in 2022 and 2023.
We appreciate we having people in because we have set the standards. We have adhered what is required to be done. And it's been easy for us, I can say, because after all this, what is the results? We are getting people in with the revenues that we need to accommodate the staffs back.
Against this backdrop, there's still the challenge of controlling the pandemic while supporting economic recovery. Despite many workers returning to work in the hotel industry in Kenya, the management is actually very cautious not to be complacent because this time around they are well aware that the COVID-19 pandemic is still here with us and they have to do the rehiring with utmost care and, of course, planning. Nick Mudimba, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Let's step back with our next story, take a much broader view of the continent. The COVID-19 pandemic has pushed an estimated 30 million people right across sub-Saharan Africa into extreme poverty. It's wiping out more than 5 years of progress in poverty eradication. Now, accelerating growth has aided Africa in achieving the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, but the continent as a whole is not predicted to be able to meet enough of the target to actually eradicate poverty by 2030. In fact, by one line of argument, as you'll hear shortly, that target is basically out of reach now. Economists have forecast that the continent will still have an estimated 500 million people living on subsistence terms by then. That's 25 million more compared to pre-pandemic projections. Now, after many years of decline, the turn of the century marked quite the turning point for Africa's economy. Gross domestic product per capita rose at an average of 2.5% per year all the way through to 2015. Up from an average annual decline of 1% in the preceding 2 decades. The share of people living below the World Bank's extreme poverty line of $1.90 a day fell from 58% in the year 2000 to 42% by 2015. All right, then, so let's explore the damage inflicted on sub-Saharan economies by the COVID-19 pandemic. Boyhotlo Kasalawe is an economist with Bloomberg. She's joining us now from Johannesburg. Thank you for your time this evening. Interesting paper from your end, but let's start with that headline number from the IMF. It's pretty stark. 30 million people pushed into extreme poverty across the continent. But walk us through the variations involved in that number and the effect that we're looking at also in income gaps.
Well, thank you very much for that question. I cannot speak for the IMF, but I can certainly walk you through our numbers. They have an estimate of 30 million, which is quite close to ours of 35 million. And what I'd like to point out here is that that number is actually the additional number of people that would be plunged into poverty as a result of the crisis. So that would take the total number of people living in subsistence living to around 470 million today. How did we arrive at that number? It's quite simple, really. If you think about how forceful the COVID-19 shock was. In fact, it was so forceful that it plunged the region into its first recession in 25 years. We saw a contraction of around 2% in GDP. And if you translate that into livelihoods or how you see people then being drawn into poverty, if you think about Africa, a lot of people, most economies have a very informal structure. And right when the pandemic hit, we had these very forceful lockdowns, really. And what that meant is that people were unable to go out and go out on the streets and work. If you ran a business, you were unable to operate. And if you had a job, you might have lost it. And why we saw such a stark, or why we have such a stark number in Africa in particular, also reflects government's response to the pandemic. What we saw in advanced economies was quite a forceful or very strong fiscal response, about 10% of GDP. But African governments had quite elevated debt levels, which prevented them from being able to provide a similar response. So we saw a response of around 0.5% of GDP. And if you want to compare that in dollar terms, you're looking at about a 7,000 USD sort of response in advanced economies versus less than $50 in Africa. And that shows you how, you stop people from working or being able to earn an income, and you can't compensate for that. And so we saw 35 million more people being plunged into poverty as a result of the crisis.
Indeed, and also as part of your modelling, you're forecasting that we'll still likely have 500 million people under the poverty line by 2030 as well. I guess the main question here would be, walk us through how this pandemic is sticky in terms of making it much harder for people to recover from the income shocks that they dealt with in 2020 and 2021.
Correct. Thank you very much for that question. So you are right. So we have 30 million more people being plunged into poverty, 2020, 2021. And by the end of 2030, of course, you're able to close some of that gap, but you still have 25 million more people living in poverty. And the reason for that is you have a persistent, let's call it loss in income. I've already spoken about the fact that governments were unable to provide a similar response. Another reason we're seeing in the region is the fact that, our vaccination rates have pretty much lagged the rest of the world. So you're looking, today, less than 10% of African populations are partially vaccinated, and this compares with over 50% for the rest of the world. And the impact of that is that Africa will be unable to reopen its economies at the same pace as the rest of the world. Another reason is that we have quite elevated debt levels. So yes, we will recover, but a huge share of our revenues thereafter will be used to service rising debt service costs, even after the pandemic effects sort of fade. And in short, you have a permanent loss of income that's not recovered, and we estimate that to be about roughly 5%, really because of the scarring or the permanent damage that the pandemic has inflicted on most economies. We expect a full recovery, I think, in about 4 years' time, sort of back to the pre-pandemic level. And that just shows you how slowly Africa is recovering relative to the rest of the world. Advanced markets will be back this year, early next year at the latest.
Let's talk about one of those. Let's talk about one of those advanced markets, China. You argue it's a critical partner for future growth through through trade and through investment as well. But we're seeing, at least in the last couple of years, we're seeing this slowdown in lending coming in through from China. Uganda, for example, is looking for funding for its standard gauge rail line. That hasn't happened. Kenya is looking for funding for the second leg of its standard gauge rail line. That hasn't come through. So is the thesis that, we're still going to have China funding a significant part of the infrastructure development that's needed across the continent? Does that still hold true?
Yes, we still stand by that thesis. And yes, you are correct that lending has slowed down. But if you look at the total debt portfolio in Africa, it's still the biggest lender in the region. At the same time, let's call it, its ties with the region have also increased quite significantly. So we had overall trade with China around 4% at the beginning of the decade, at around 2000. And that's up to 20% now. So we think China remains quite heavily invested in the region. And we think the slowdown that you're seeing actually reflects, shall we call it, an improvement in the quality of lending. I think we've had varied experiences across the continent with lending in China. And I think China is now a little bit more selective about the kinds of projects it's investing in. I think it's tightening its lending terms. And yeah, I think that's part of the reasons we're seeing for the slowdown. But also China remains, sort of a lender of last resort, coming in always where there's more risk. And talking about the improvement in quality and maybe tighter selection criteria, I think China is also a little bit more hesitant to go in where you already have quite clear sort of debt problems. A good example here might be Angola, even Mozambique, and I think the projects you outlined might actually be suffering from some of those problems that I've outlined. So I think it's tighter selection rather than decreased appetite, if you will.
All right. And debt, of course, does seem to be the one common denominator weaving through this entire conversation. It's a sort of millstone that's holding back governments from being able to respond forcefully where they need to do so. But is there an argument for debt cancellation at this point in time, or is the moral hazard involved in that sort of thing just too great?
Look, this is a very, very good question. The international community's response to Africa's debt burden has been the debt suspension initiative, as you know. We think this is a really good and quick way to free up resources. But a big problem with that program has been that the funding that's channeled has actually been to the most indebted countries, rather than those who are most in need or those that were most affected by the crisis. And a good example here is Angola. It's not even a DSSA country, but it was the biggest beneficiary of the program. Sort of to answer your question, I'd like to propose an alternative. Our view is actually that the international community should have given Africa net transfers, or put differently, sort of direct aid. And what that does is it compensates for the full effect of the pandemic. In other words, it puts African countries in no worse position than what they would have been had the pandemic not happened. And the benefit of the solution is that, one, you give sort of aid where it's most needed, but also you then don't run the risk or have the negative connotations associated with debt relief. We already had it in the early 2000s, and debt levels are back up to where they were sort of when we had that debt relief. So the advantage of this is that you still put countries in a position where they still have to exercise fiscal restraint. They still have to continue with the reforms that they had before. And there's no loss or fear of, a ratings downgrade, or maybe, not having access to the market as a result of participating in the program. And importantly, you also don't have the risk of moral hazard that you outlined. So the answer is, we think net transfers would have been the better solution rather than debt relief or even the DSSI program that we saw.
Indeed. We'll leave it there for the time being. Thank you very much. An economist there from Bloomberg. Now then, trade and economic relations between China and Africa have grown substantially under the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. The Chinese Vice Commerce Minister, Chiang Kai-ming, said that China remains Africa's largest single trading partner for 12 straight years as of the end of 2020. Chinese firms have so far established more than 3,500 enterprises of various sorts across the continent, with over 70% of the investment coming from privately owned firms. Moreover, China's direct investment in Africa, that's topped over $43 billion. It makes China essentially the fourth largest investor country across the continent.
For example, many fine agricultural products that China has imported from other countries, such as sesame and peanuts, come from Africa. Other products you can now see on the market include olive oil from Tunis, coffee from Ethiopia, and chili sauce from Rwanda. The complementary advantages of Chinese and African industries are quite significant. Chinese enterprises have been actively expanding their investment in Africa, which is of great help in terms of creating local jobs, improving industrial levels, and promoting economic inclusiveness. In the meantime, Chinese enterprises have been optimizing their business layout and quickening their pace of exploring the international market. Their transnational operation and management capabilities and awareness of social responsibility have also improved significantly.
China and Tanzania are evaluating an agricultural project that the two countries set up nearly a decade ago. Tanzanian farmers say it's helped them increase their food output. Agricultural cooperation between Beijing and Dar es Salaam aims to boost maize production, ensure food security and lift a lot more farmers out of poverty. A virtual meeting between representatives of both countries was held on Tuesday. Agricultural experts and representatives from the United Nations Office for South-South Cooperation were also in attendance.
The meeting aims to assess the project named Small Technology Big Harvest. It was started in Tanzania's Morogoro region nearly 10 years ago. During the meeting, project participants from China and Tanzania spoke on the achievements, challenges, and explained their next plans to improve agricultural production.
The target of this project was to reach 2,000 farmers, but up to now we've reached 1,665 farmers, equivalent to 83% of the target.
The project introduced Chinese farming technology and emphasized cooperation among local farmers, universities, and local government. It initially started with less than 100 farmers in PP village, but it has spread to 10 villages across the Morogoro region.
It is 9 years since I joined to facilitate this project. Of course, I got good harvests because at the beginning I was getting 3, 4 to 5 bags per acre, but now I can get 15 to 18 bags in 1 acre. Previously, it was too hard to harvest to that quantity.
The farmers say their family income and quality of life have improved since joining the project.
When I started to cultivate, I saw the achievement. I've managed to purchase a motorcycle. I've constructed a house. Previously, I had a 4-roomed house, but now I have a 9-roomed house.
Tanzania hopes the existing cooperation with Chinese agricultural experts will bring more fruitful impacts to the sector and people's livelihood.
China has provided approximately 80 million to FAO since 2009 through phases of a trust fund to support the FAO China South-South Cooperation Program. Through the program, more than 290 Chinese agricultural extension technicians were deployed in 12 countries, directly benefiting more than 70,000 people in rural areas and indirectly benefiting several hundreds of thousands of people.
Agriculture is one of the key important sectors of Tanzania's economy, as it contributes to over 29% of the GDP. The sector employs over 65% of Tanzanians. Noktula Shabalala, CGTN.
All right, then, so it's back to business for many an economy here in Africa, despite the cloud of COVID-19 still hovering across the continent. Thousands of people have converged in the South African coastal city of Durban for the second Intra-African Trade Fair. It's one of the largest trade events on the continent, and it's aimed at deepening trade among the 55 states that call Africa home. CGTN's Julie Shire is there.
The exhibition hall at the Intra-African Trade Fair in Durban is abuzz with sales, trade deals and business meetings. Over 1,000 companies from all over the continent are showing off their goods and services.
We've had a lot of interest in our product from parts of Africa and around the world. So we're actually very excited, and we think this trade show is actually going to bring the world together. And I think that it's an excellent opportunity for us to showcase Africa and more Durban.
It's a great opportunity for local businesses, even though it's hard for most of local brands. We don't make much, so we don't have like all the resources and quality and everything like that.
Trade between African nations stand at a mere 16%, with international brands still dominating local markets.
It's amounted to between $450 to $500 billion worth of goods that Africa imports. In terms of services, Africa imports annually about $150 billion. So if you add both of those, you're already talking almost $700 billion worth of goods. The intra-Africa trade objective is to reverse some of that.
But small businesses here say there needs to be more clarity on what it means for them.
I'm a commodity trader. How do I move my products from the port of Durban into sub-Saharan Africa? How does it not be stopped at the border? What documentation do they need? And bandwidth, is it real time? All these issues need to be ironed out.
The African Continental Free Trade Agreement has been hailed by leaders here as one of the most significant milestones since its inception in January. For it to work, however, leaders will have to move rapidly to boost trade by 50% in the next 30 years. Julie Shara, CGTN, Durban, South Africa.
Authorities in Egypt are cracking down on dealers in the automotive industry after a surge in car prices there. Increased demand for automobiles amid supply shortages that we're seeing pretty much all over the world caused by the pandemic have led to some car dealers apparently taking advantage of the crisis to really raise prices. CGTN's Yasser Hakim filed this report.
Overpricing has been a common practice in Egypt for years, but it intensifies whenever there's a drop in supply. The latest has been caused by factory shutdowns, disruptions in the global supply, and shortages of semiconductors around the world due to the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic. Traders are unofficially overcharging customers who are in quick need of a car.
It's an unhealthy phenomenon that doesn't exist in most markets and shouldn't exist in Egypt because extreme overpricing is an abuse of the client. It's actually harming everyone involved in the market. The trader is unable to import the quantity he wants, the same with the agent and distributor. The result is that the client will either have to wait for months or even a year for a car or pay more to get one.
Many traders are not putting a price tag on the car. Amr Suleiman, who is an agent to a Chinese car brand, says some traders manipulate clients by changing prices on an hourly basis, raising it to over 20% and thereby causing distortions in the auto market.
This is a free market based on supply and demand. Selling at higher price is not the problem because it happens during shortages, but overpricing is selling at a higher price than the one on the receipt, thus evading taxes on the difference. That's tax evasion.
It also infringes the client's rights, who in the case of a refund would only receive the amount in the bill, not what he actually paid. The government had to intervene. It has forced car dealers to stick a price tag on every car's windscreen and to issue a bill with the official price on the tag. Those who don't abide by it would face a jail sentence and hefty fines that could reach $130,000.
It's a very good decision and will reduce the overpricing to an extent because when traders put an official price ticket on the car, they are obliged to sell at this price and issue a bill accordingly. This will cut tax evasion, especially with the newly introduced anti-tax evasion laws in place.
Market players expect the global semiconductor issue to be resolved by the end of the year. That will ensure a constant supply of cars and an end to overpricing by the second quarter of 2022. Yasser Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up. The WTO is pushing for multilateral trade deals to boost economic resilience given some unexpected shocks. And young Americans are leading a social campaign to cope with high costs of living after the COVID-19 pandemic.
Change is on the horizon. Through the shifting of time,
Africa's emerging tech landscape is creating new channels.
There's a hunger for local African content globally.
Shaped by innovation, carved out by a new generation of digital entrepreneurs, sculpted by a mobile revolution, trickling down to the most remote corners of the continent. TechSpot is seeking out the new concepts in technology, disrupting Africa's traditional sectors.
You're watching breaking news on CGTN.
Welcome to the world today on CGTN.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant.
Only on CGTN.
Welcome back to the program. The World Trade Organization has released its World Trade Report for 2021. It focuses on vulnerability and resilience of the global trading system, and it explores how trade can help countries to better withstand economic shocks. The report says that the global economy has become a lot more resilient despite making the world more vulnerable to natural and man-made disasters. Remember the Ever Given, anyone? It further states that more regional and multilateral cooperation is needed to further increase economic resilience. The WTO Director General, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, says that the WTO is conducting negotiations in fields that will create more opportunities for inclusive trade and diversification, and also make economies a lot more resilient in the future. The White House says that engagement with Beijing will intensify on multiple levels, following up on the two presidents' pledge to manage competition to avoid conflict between the world's two largest economies. Here's Nathan King with that story.
Warm words from the two heads of state as their first face-to-face encounter began. President Xi called President Biden an old friend. Biden returned the compliment and said next time he wanted to meet in person. But as the talk stretched past 3 hours, it was clear this was about the details of the most important bilateral relationship, not just the pleasantries. While there were no immediate breakthroughs, the US did restate its commitment to the One China policy and disavowed any moves in support of Taiwan independence.
President Biden underscored his commitment to the One China policy, which is guided by the Taiwan Relations Act, the 3 joint communiques, and the 6 assurances. He also reminded President Xi that he voted for the Taiwan Relations Act as a senator. And so he understands deeply, firsthand, that the act makes clear that any effort to shape Taiwan's future by other than peaceful means is of grave concern to the United States.
Other promising signs, warm words over working together more closely on climate, global public health, energy and supply chain security. And the US said that the trade representative is looking into enforcing the terms of the Phase 1 trade deal, which could lead to the lowering of tariffs. There are also more signals from the US about granting more visas to Chinese journalists and potentially other groups as well. But perhaps the most significant achievement of these meetings was the fact that the tone was much warmer than we've seen in the frosty exchanges over the past few years. That will act as a stabilizing force both in Washington and in Beijing and come as a relief to many capitals in the region of the Asia Pacific and around the rest of the world. Nathan King, CGTN, just outside the White House.
In the meantime, as the US continues to battle the economic impact of COVID-19, supply chain issues and the growing threat of climate change, an increasing number of Americans are now signing up to social media groups that encourage people to give away or share items for free. It comes as research is showing that younger people are taking up thrifting at a much higher rate than the generations before them. Sarah Walton explores this.
Debbie Cross's Manhattan apartment is full of plants, and she gets more cuttings than she knows what to do with. So she gives them away for free online. Debbie coordinates her local Buy Nothing group, using social media to exchange all sorts of items.
It can be a jacket that doesn't fit you, it can be your kids' shoes that they outgrew, it can be a kitchen item that you received from somebody very well-intentioned, but you don't bake.
Formed in the US in 2013, the Buy Nothing project follows in the footsteps of groups like FreeCycle and Craigslist. It now has 6,800 groups in 44 nations, each designed to bring neighbourhoods together and help people live a more sustainable life.
I also think there is a desire from people to be a little more environmentally conscious and not send items that they don't need anymore to the landfill. With the pandemic, I also think that people were home more, and then they realized that they had, they wanted to declutter a little bit.
People can also donate their time or services. But no matter how big or small, the founder's main principle is that it must be given for free.
The special sauce is what makes the Buy Nothing project special, is that in a gift economy, the value of everything is equal, right? There is no difference between want and need, and everybody is able to give something of themselves. So it's empowering, and it helps people realize that if you just look around and take inventory of the blessings in your life, everybody has something to give, and at some point in time, everybody is going to need or want something.
The company recently launched an app after membership rose from 1.5 million people at the beginning of 2020 to more than 4.2 across the world. And that follows a growing trend for reusable goods. A survey commissioned by online thrift store ThreadUp shows millennials and Gen Z are taking to buying second-hand 2.5 times faster than any other age group. And it projects the thrifting market will double in size in the next 5 years to $77 billion. Entrepreneur Majida Mundial has been part of her local Buy Nothing group for almost a year.
You're coming for the plant, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Here you go, and show it.
Majida says the project has really helped her get to know her neighbours.
I'm a millennial, and there's definitely millennials, and there's definitely Gen Z, but there's also a lot of older generations as well in there. And I think at this juncture, with everything with COVID and everybody just like reassessing the importance of everything, being wasteful is not something a lot of people are leaning towards right now.
With an estimated 300,000 items in the average American household and an increasing market for second-hand goods, the Buy Nothing project says it simply makes sense to find more ways to bring together that supply and demand. Sarah Walton, CGTN, New York.
Now, Cuba has reopened its air borders to international travel under eased pandemic protocols. The move aims at recovering the tourism sector, which has been hit particularly hard by this pandemic. CGTN's Luis Chirino reports.
The November 15 air border reopening aims at increasing the number of international travelers to boost the tourist sector, hard hit by the coronavirus pandemic. Weekly flights will increase to more than 400 from 63. Following the reopening, the number of flights arriving at Jose Marti International Airport from the U.S. have increased this week.
I'm fully vaccinated against COVID-19 and wanted to come here because this is my country.
Singing how beautiful my Cuba is, this 81-year-old U.S. resident entered the country. The reopening includes eliminating the mandatory quarantine period for travelers at local hotels and replacing it with proof of vaccination or negative PCR test taken 72 hours before arrival. Travelers will also be offered immunization against the virus with locally developed vaccines if they wish.
The country's reopening comes after most Cubans have been immunized against COVID-19, which also allowed the reopening of important social services.
CGTN visited local schools where students and teachers were happy to resume their school year after months of confinement at home during virtual learning. Although school students are fully vaccinated, they abide by all protection and sanitary rules against the pandemic.
emocionada.
I was eagerly waiting for this re-encounter to help our students conclude their course with good grades and prepare them for secondary education.
I'm happy to return with my peers and my teachers, hoping to pass my exams for secondary school.
Visitors and locals are now able to enjoy Cuban cultural facilities, parks and boulevards while abiding by COVID-19 protection measures on the road to a new normalcy. Luis Chirino, CGTN, Havana.
Earlier this month, Brazil raised $8.5 billion in an auction of 5G spectrum to interested mobile service operators. The Chinese telecom giant Huawei didn't take part in that particular auction, but it says it's ready to play a prominent role when the time comes to start building the 5G transmission towers. In the Sao Paulo countryside, Huawei has been operating a warehouse based on this particular tech that serves as a showcase of its potential. CGTN's Paulo Cabral took a look on what's hot tonight.
These robots know their way around the Huawei smart warehouse with precision. Through a 5G network set up with 12 antennas in here, they get information on what each sector of the warehouse needs, collect the material and deliver it to the correct line.
The 5G technology which implemented here already almost 2 years ago. Okay, so after that it promoted a big change in our operation.
The robots are the most distinctive feature of Huawei's Smart Campus, a fully automated warehouse set up by the Chinese company not only to improve their operations but also to showcase what 5G can bring to Brazilian businesses.
After we implemented the technology here in our process, we gain for sure productivity. Okay, so our productivity increased in more than 25%. This warehouse is a real example on how technology can change your process, can improve your process. So the purpose to have this here is to show the possibilities to other companies as well.
Here, all incoming parts and products are tagged with RFID labels, so forklift operators can easily get information on where they have to be stored and then quickly retrieve the material when it's needed for production or to be shipped to customers.
The 5G revolution is coming, and Brazil wants to be in position to make the most of it. But for that to happen, experts say heavy investment is needed to bring the country's telecom infrastructure up to speed.
When we compare to other countries in Latin America, our infrastructure is not so dense. That creates a situation here where we have an incredible demand push with lack of infrastructure. So we hope with the 5G auction that we will have significant improvements.
Huawei is one of the world's biggest players in providing 5G technology, and the Chinese company wants to show it's ready to take a leading role in Brazil's development of its telecom network. Paulo Cabral, CGTN in Sorocaba, Brazil.
All right, then a quick run through commodity prices. It seems coffee is just producing one surprise after another this week. Coffee futures setting yet another multi-year high. They've gone as high as 230.90 today. At those levels, prices on these contracts have gone up by almost 70% so far in the year. We spoke about Ghana a little earlier. All production levels are there, forecast to fall slightly next year, partly due to deferred work programs. Forecast output for 2022, according to the National Petroleum Corporation over there, will be about 2% lower at around 146,000 barrels a day. But natural gas output, that's heading in the opposite direction. It's forecast to rise by 13.6% to 318 million cubic feet a day. In a trading update today, Tullow says it expects to get about $75 million from Total next year. It shares in London were nearly 2% higher today. That takes its year-to-date rise to just under 65%. Here's what's coming up next. We'll explore how camels are offering a lifeline to nomads given drought and climate change in the Horn of Africa.
Africa is a continent of diversity, with varied climates and enchanting geography, and a people so distinct, but with a shared enduring spirit. We are at the heart of the continent to bring you the untold stories
Let's have a look.
We celebrate Africa as it shapes its own destiny.
Tunis, Cairo,
Juba,
Johannesburg, Ethiopia, Tanzania.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back. Let's head over to Somalia. The livestock industry over there is the main contributor to economic growth and livelihoods in Somalia. And in normal years, it accounts for roughly 80% of exports. But life as a nomad in Somalia has been riddled by enormous challenges, particularly drought and climate change. But despite grappling with all these shortcomings, the community of pastoralists over there maintain that the camel is still king. CGTN's Nokutule Shabalala has that story.
Patrolling the Somali desert can be quite long and taxing for a nomad like Ali Abdi El-Mai. His adventure companion is his camels that he milks to be able to survive. For many Somalis, they believe the camel is a gift from the gods. Aside from providing nomads with milk, the camel offers meat and is viewed as an insurance in times of crisis.
I drink camel milk because it's nourishing. The milk is good for us because camels graze from trees with medicinal properties that help fight diseases. I have 5 children and we all depend on camel milk to survive.
Estimated at 7 million, there are more camels in Somalia than almost anywhere else. Camels don't just confer respect on their owners, they fetch much higher prices. An impressive specimen can carry a $1,000 price tag.
Camels are important to Somali culture because one is always considered wealthy or can rise in social status by the number of camels they have.
The pastoral life is a difficult one, made more so by increasing erratic rainfall over the Horn of Africa. Scientists say the region is drying faster now than at any other time in the past 2,000 years. The loss of livestock invariably spells hunger, and herders have fled to cities in recent years as life on the land has become unsustainable.
As a breeder, I have to face many difficulties. I am facing drought and famine, which has consequences. My fellow ranchers and I have lost a lot of camels and cattle.
A sale transaction is made by locking hands under the checkered shawls carried by herders. The number of knuckles tapped and fingers grasped determines the price. This tradition aims to ensure negotiations are kept private. The transaction is completed by a mobile money transfer, a modern touch to an ancient way of doing business. Nokutule Shabalala, CGTN.
All right, then a quick run through the currency. We focused on Ghana at the start of the hour, so let's focus on that at the end as well. Ghana's currency has, of course, been weakening steadily against American dollars since April. That trend has largely continued even today at 6.1287. Not only is it close to its weakest all year, it's also about 4.5% weaker against the dollar so far in 2021. Now, the yields on 4 of Ghana's Eurobonds, the 2025, 2026, 2027 and 2032 notes have essentially doubled as well. The first 3, in fact, now have yields between 11.2% and 12.4%. The yield on the 2032 note, that's well over 7%. That's where we're going to leave this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content we've seen on the program in the last hour. Many ways to get your thoughts back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.